Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle, episode 77. I wanted to talk about absurdity versus satire, which is two things that get mixed up quite frequently. But 77, I have these associations between numbers, and 77 I always reference sensory deprivation or of some sort, which is a tricky one to integrate every time I run across the number 77. Because I wrote a play many, many years ago called 77 about a kid who was in a sensory deprivation tank. And this would be a perfect opportunity to talk about defamiliarization. For whatever reason, that was episode 75. Whenever I shot episode 75, I kept saying defamiliarization and refamiliarization. I'm not sure why I kept saying refamiliarization. That has really nothing to do with it. To, to continue to destimulate, I don't know. But defamiliarization is taking something that has reduced stimulant power because it's become overly familiar. Defamiliarization is to take that thing that has become familiar and enhance the stimulation of it by defamiliarizing it. And there's so many techniques that you can use. This is where this episode and last episode and episode 75 all come together. You can use bathos. Bathos is a great technique. Any sort of juxtaposition is a pretty great technique to take something familiar and place it side by side with something unfamiliar. The ultimate goal there is to enhance the stimulation, and stimulation could be any sort of emotional or visceral response to that particular image. And so, one of my favorite ways that this shows up is in really more purely, truly absurd juxtapositions, and you get that some of my favorite sketch comedy I was just talking about starts off with a really absurd premise. There are tons of Monty Python sketches. Probably in the context of defamiliarization, really one of the best sketches of all time is the story of Mount Everest. Which involves somebody trying to tell the story of climbing Mount Everest, and he falls into this wall, breaks all these things behind him on this shelf, and he just keeps doing it. He keeps doing it over and over again, and so there's this whole fascinating trajectory of defamiliarization where over and over and over again he's just falling into this wall as he's trying to tell the story of Mount Everest. It's very absurd. Most of the time in a sketch like that, you need to ramp it up. So you'll have this absurd premise, and then you just keep stepping it up. But the story of Mount Everest is brilliant because it doesn't do that. It does the exact same thing, essentially, the exact same thing just over and over again, and people have these different responses to it. So if you consider something truly absurd like that, why is he falling? Who cares? It's really funny. That's why. What is the point of the sketch? It's funny. It's weird. Things happen for no reason. And that's, from an artistic perspective, that's the only justification you actually need. And I talked about this when I talked about Enemy. Why is there a giant spider in the room? Well, because there is. Something that's truly absurd, that's really the only explanation that you need. And I would reference some of my favorite really, really absurd stories or plays. It's hard to really get good examples that somebody hasn't tried to explain at some point and given it a meaning. From an artistic perspective, it doesn't need a meaning. All the Ionesco plays, pretty much all of them, some of my favorite things ever written, but pretty much all of them, I would argue the best way to read them from an artist, as someone creating the art, I should say, is just to look at how he manipulates the stimulation, how he heightens the stimulation. So how does he take, like a basic premise like characters turning into rhinoceroses, and how does he take that and ramp it up each time so that you have the same sort of thing occurring, and it occurs for whatever reason. There's no real explanation of why people turn into rhinoceroses, and there it needs not be any explanation. how does he keep ramping that up each time so that it continues to be stimulating, even though it's essentially the same sort of plot point that continues to happen? And Ionesco's brilliant at that. And the chairs is one of my favorites. They expect people to come over to this to their home, this old couple. I should probably do a video just on the chairs just because I love it so much. But just as an example, they expect these people to come over and they're going to save the world, and it turns out to be invisible people. They put out chairs. There's a lot of interpretations, but let's just say they're invisible people. They put out chairs for the invisible people to sit on, and so all you see of the people arriving at this house are just these chairs, and it continues to accumulate. Brilliant play. Who are the people? Why are they there? For me, it doesn't matter, but there are plenty of interpretations. But if you look at something like Rhinoceros, commonly interpreted as a satire of fascism. So satire, the way satire functions, is on the opposite end of the spectrum of visceral stimulation. So if you look at the rainbow circle, the middle of the rainbow circle is pure visceral stimulation. It's pure absurdity in the sense that you have images that exist for the sake of pure stimulation, and they don't have to mean anything whatsoever. Satire functions at the other end of the spectrum, where the function of the text is rhetorical. It's dualistically rhetorical, where you have all of these mechanisms of destimulation. So commonly people will interpret the Rhinoceros and a lot of Ionesco plays, unfortunately. I'm saying unfortunately from an entirely personal perspective. My cats are trying to murder each other now. Why does everyone have to fight? I have 4 mammals sitting right in front of me right now. 2 dogs and 2 cats. At any given moment, they almost just might start fighting each other. Mammals. Anyway, I'm going to make a satire just called Mammals. It'll be interesting, actually. But anyway, so if you look at something like Rhinoceros in terms of absurdity, they turn into rhinoceroses. There's no reason for it. They just do. And people have just a wide variety of responses to it. If you look at satire is designed to communicate a particular rhetorical point. Fascism is bad. And here's how fascism spreads. 2 entirely different functions at 2 ends of the spectrum. From my perspective, from an artistic perspective, I have nothing really wrong with satire. I just don't think the value is in the rhetorical point necessarily, because that's displacing the value from the text. So just from an artistic perspective, I choose not to place value outside of the actual piece of art. A satire places value in the argument. From the perspective of an artist, I don't want to place value in the argument. I want to place value in the art. And then even the chairs. And chairs is one of my favorites, partly because it's harder to really interpret in that way. Even the chairs, people will say, well, it's just satire of the intellectual elite or whatever. I mean, people will still interpret that as a satire. But it doesn't have to actually mean anything. Ionesco argued constantly about that. Sartre said, I like Rhinoceros because it critiques fascism, but it doesn't actually come to any kind of conclusion about how to do that. Anyway. But if you look at great pieces that are overtly satirical, Voltaire's Candide, one of the great classic satires. If you look at A Modest Proposal, another one of the great classic satires. If you want to look at 2 of the most disturbingly violent things ever written, A Modest Proposal details how to eat babies in really graphic detail. Candide, really extremely graphic things happen to the characters, and then the characters come back to life, and extremely violent graphic things happen to the characters again. One of the most violent books ever written. So from the perspective of a writer, what I would recognize about that is that in order to avoid displacing the value to something outside of the actual artistic piece, I would say the endpoint value, the rhetorical endpoint value, tempers that those extreme images. If you want to consider, a modest proposal an art, a piece of art, I would say I would extend that definition very, very broadly. But as a piece of art, modest proposal is able to effectively communicate these really disturbing images to the audience because there is a rhetorical endpoint, and it's able to temper, it's able to dilute the extremes of the violence. Candide is a delightful read. I tend to like violent things, so that doesn't bother me. I like horror movies and what have you. It doesn't really bother me necessarily, but part of the reason it is so fun is because of how extremely over the top it is. But I think the satirical function of a book like Candide really functions within the text to temper the extremes of the violence, so that you can have this really wacky, over the top tone, and you have a different purpose than just merely shock, and so therefore it has the right combination of elements so that it lands much more effectively. If you think about cooking something, you have the right combination of ingredients. The extreme violence gives it this over the top wacky tone that makes it really, really entertaining. But that might short circuit an average reader's ability to enjoy it because it's so over the top, because it's so violent. The satire then functions not necessarily to make an argument. That is a function entirely separate from the narrative itself, arguably. It's an endpoint that displaces the value from the text. But the value within the text is that it functions to temper the stimulation. It functions as a right combination. Putting sweet and salty things together so that they both enhance each other. Now, that's the main point about the absurdity and the satire. I've been hearing a lot of these things about millennial humor is so weird. And I have a pet peeve about the word weird, and then they'll show something that's not actually weird. It's just satirical. Satire is not really weird. It has weird, superficial components, but it doesn't rise to the level of absurdity unless it didn't actually mean anything. And some of the memes that they'll show in those little think pieces, sometimes they'll be weird, sometimes they'll just be satirical, and arguably those have very different functions. But anyway, the satire thing comes up with my story 77 about the kid who goes away. This is a story from a long, long time ago, 20 years ago now, about a kid who goes away to a sensory deprivation tank. His father sells him to a sensory deprivation tank, sells him to science. And he comes back and he is able to defamiliarize. So there's where the defamiliarization comes in. Everything is really extreme and intense for him because he's been in the sensory deprivation tank. But the family he comes back to is also really over the top and weird and satirical seeming. And you can read it as a satire of the American Family Unit or whatever. But really, just from a writer's perspective, I was doing it just because I liked it and I thought it was funny. That's it. Does the humor come from the satirical quality of it? It doesn't really matter to me. I wasn't making an argument about the American Family. It's a father who sells his son to a sensory deprivation tank for science. Had nothing to do with my own father. It had nothing to do with any sort of argument I was making about the American Family. It was just something I thought was funny, and that was it. And that's an entirely valid response. But I empower anyone who wants to say, I did it just because it was funny, or did it just because it was pretty, or did it just because it was emotionally intense, whatever. Feel free to say anything like that. But but I wanted to connect it with the Opal Beam War project. I want to try to cover all 30 stories at some point. But the one, I mean, I have absurdities in all 30. That's just the nature of what I do. That's just what I do. The genius of my um, my modus operandi. Uh, that did sound really douchey, but no, I mean that's just that's just what I'm interested in. So I do have absurdity in all of them. Um, and I'm uninterested in satire. I have no interest in rhetorical argumentation. So if something slips into seeming like satire, every once in a while I do it. There was a Charleston story that I did that was sort of making fun of how much people love Charleston. I was sort of riffing on that. Every once in a while, every once in a while. Why is that phrase so hard to say right now? Every once in a while, um, I'll slip into something just kind of mildly satirical, but I really have no interest in rhetorical argumentation. Just on an entirely personal level, anybody can do it if they wanted to. I don't really care. It's their choice. If the piece still works, it still works. But I choose not in interpreting it to displace the value to the argumentation. Um, and if you choose to displace the value to interpretation, it's up to you. But as an artist, I have no obligation to do that myself. But anyway, in the Opal Bean War, there are a handful that you could probably interpret as satirical. There's one that started out really, really mildly satirical. The prompt that I was working on, it's 30 stories based on 30 different prompts. And so one of the 30 prompts was humidity, because the South is full of so much humidity. Um, but this is a pure example of how, you know, you can have something that's satirical as a tone. I think satire is definitely a tone that is really effective to work with, without it being a rhetorical argument. So the prompt was humidity. I started writing a story called Water Cubes, and the whole idea is that. Hi, what are you barking at? You don't like that story? I like that story. It's about water cubes, but it's about how humidity gets so bad. Humidity gets so bad that random water cubes just appear across the city. It's in a city. Um, and so, I mean, it's mildly satirical in that it takes something that we all experience and ramps it up to an absurd degree. Um, but it doesn't displace the value, because I'm not arguing about how to put an end to humidity. That would be kind of silly. That would be an interesting story. Somebody trying to end humidity. But it's not a rhetorical argument about ending humidity. It's not about. I mean, I could make it a satire of how people respond to the heat, but the story ends up having nothing to do with that. It's so hot, these giant water cubes end up appearing. There's a train driver who drives into the water cube, and these people drown from his train, and he feels really guilty about it. So ultimately, I'm still trying to root it in, deep level character issues. It's much more about the train driver. It's much more about the sudden danger that appears of the water cubes. And where I just left off, he thinks that the water cubes are alive, which is an interesting thing. Oh, you heavy dog, you heavy dog. Oh, Lord. Okay. Okay. Are you settled? Finally. Okay. Anyway, that's my last point, was just that I'm not arguing about how to, by taking this thing that people complain about and ramping it up to this really absurd degree. I'm not arguing about how to end humidity. That would be ridiculous. How or why would anyone make that argument? Um, so the absence of any solution in my story is entirely irrelevant. Like Sartre might read Water Cubes and say, "You talk about humidity, but you make no suggestions about how to end it." Well, that's not really. it's not really the function of a story. I mean, that might be a component in a story. It's totally fine if it is a component in a story, but the value of the story is not in suggesting solutions. The value is not in pointing at flaws. Tonally, that might lead to some laughter. I mean, if you look at Candide, there's tons of really funny stuff in it because of the satirical quality of it. But it's valuable because it's funny, not because it's there's a solution that we can enact necessarily. Arguably. Everything I say, arguably. But anyway, I'll wrap it up for today. Thank you for joining us. And I'll see you on the next episode.